They say safety rules and regulations are written with the blood of workers. This is all too well the case also in racing. Since the dawn of the automobile race, there have been racing fatalities over every continent in every discipline. Yes, this video is shamelessly ripped off from the F1 edition posted by Peter Brook. The head and neck support device is possibly the most important piece of safety equipment ever designed, and its impact on the landscape of racing cannot be understated. It was developed in the 80s, but wasn't popular until the death of Blaise Alexander in October of 2001. Today, the Hans device is mandatory in most auto racing internationally, and it is widely acclaimed to have saved hundreds of lives since its creation. So let's take a look at historic NASCAR fatalities and see if any of them could have been prevented had a Hans device existed. To keep this video short, I'm going to go by the Wikipedia list, yeah, I know, the Wikipedia list of National Series fatalities. If we went with every division, we'd be here all day. The first NASCAR Grand National Series fatality happened on September 14th, 1952, involving 22-year-old Larry Zuckerman, or Larry Mann, from New York. He was making his 6th career start at Langhorne Speedway in Pennsylvania, Langhorne Speedway being probably the most infamous racetrack at the time for racing fatalities. The 1-mile dirt track, which was shaped in a near-perfect circle, would see several deaths of not only drivers but also spectators and track workers. Zuckerman apparently hit a guardrail and went straight through the fence, rolling several times and dying later that night after suffering multiple fractures and internal injuries. There's not going to be a lot of video for these early incidents, so the only information regarding some of these crashes is what we're going to find in these newspaper clippings from the same era. Given that the cars from this time were usually taken directly off the showroom floor and put onto the track, there were little to any safety measures in place to begin with. Even if Zuckerman had been using a Hans device, the car still had only a basic over-the-lap seatbelt and especially lacked anything resembling a roll cage. The Hans device would not have saved Larry Zuckerman. The second NASCAR Grand National Series fatality was on June 20th, 1953, and also took place at Langhorne Speedway. 42-year-old Frank Arford from Indianapolis was racing in a qualifying heat when his number 77 Oldsmobile apparently spun and crashed through the fence just like Zuckerman the year before. The car rolled 6 times, ripping Arford from his seat and throwing him around the inside of the car as it flipped. Once again, the main culprit in this incident is the lack of a strong seatbelt or roll cage in the car. The Hans device would not have saved Frank Arford. The third NASCAR Grand National Series fatality would come a year later on October 24th, 1954. Race 37 of the season was taking place at North Wilkesboro Speedway when 8th place Lou Figaro was sent into the corner, flying over the wall and upside down out of the track. The roof of the car unsurprisingly caved in and crushed Figaro. He was taken to a local hospital and declared dead the next day. Figaro had actually won a Grand National race in 1951 near his hometown in California. He had taken 2 years off before returning to the series in 1954, where this fatal crash would take place in his 3rd start of the year. As I mentioned before, the roof had caved in on his number 187 Hudson, and the Hans device would not have saved Lou Figaro. The 4th NASCAR Grand National Series fatality occurred on April 21st, 1956. 29-year-old John McVitie was making a qualifying run at Langhorne Speedway when an unknown issue occurred and his Chevrolet rolled. Yet again, the problem was the lack of a roll cage in the car, and the Hans device would not have saved John McVitie. NASCAR would only run 3 more races at Langhorne before finally leaving the track for good after 1957, no doubt in part to the 3 fatal crashes at the track we've outlined thus far. The fifth NASCAR Grand National Series fatality would come 6 weeks later on June 9th, 1956. 28-year-old Clint McHugh of Biloxi, Mississippi was attempting to qualify for his first career start in the Grand National Series at the Memphis, Arkansas Raceway in Lehigh. His Oldsmobile was apparently running at an estimated 90 miles an hour when he lost control and flipped out of the track, crashing into a nearby lake and being thrown from the vehicle. He would die from a number of injuries at the hospital shortly after. Clearly, this was a seatbelt malfunction, meaning the Hans device would not have saved Clint McHugh. The sixth NASCAR Grand National Series fatality would occur 1 day later at the same track. 27-year-old Thomas Cotton Pretty was on the 39th lap of the 167-lap feature race when he lost a wheel from contact with another unknown vehicle. In a harrowingly similar incident to McHugh's, Pretty would flip several times and also be thrown from the vehicle. He would be transported to and would die at the same hospital as well. As with McHugh, the lack of a strong seatbelt and roll cage is what ended Pretty's life, and the Hans device would not have saved him. The seventh Grand National Series fatality came on September 2nd, 1957, and would be the first in the Southern 500 at Darlington. 30-year-old Bobby Myers of Winston-Salem was running the number 4 for Petty Enterprises when Fonny Flock had an issue in front of him. Myers plowed into Flock and flipped, with Paul Goldsmith also striking the Flock car. All three would be hospitalized, but only Myers would succumb to his injuries. This is the first fatal crash on the list I've been able to find footage for, and the crash is visibly violent, but details are quite vague on the condition of Myers immediately after the wreck. While it's likely his seatbelt failed, it isn't clear. Given that Flock and Goldsmith both survived their wrecks, and given that the cockpit of Myers 4 held up decently, I'm willing to posit that the Hans device may have saved Bobby Myers. The eighth Grand National Series fatality wouldn't come for another 7 years, when on January 19th, 1964, two-time and defending Grand National Series champion Joe Weatherly lost his brakes in a hard right-hander at the Riverside Road Course in California. This was a wicked hard crash, even for today's standards. There was hardly any give in the body of the Mercury, meaning Weatherly absorbed as much of the impact as he could have. This hit being on the driver's side also meant Weatherly took even more of the hit directly. Let's not forget that the wall he hit was also solid concrete. Even though the Hans device was designed specifically to protect a driver in this exact kind of wreck, given all the surrounding context from this incident and the era in which it took place, I cannot confidently say that the Hans device would have saved Joe Weatherly. The ninth Grand National Series fatality came 4 months later on May 24th, 1964 in the World 600 at Charlotte. Junior Johnson hooked Ned Jarrett off of turn 2, and in the ensuing wreck, the Holman Moody number 22 of Fireball Roberts was collected and eventually flipped. Both Jarrett and Roberts' cars caught fire after the incident, but Jarrett was able to climb from his car quickly, and he went to aid Roberts, who was reportedly still conscious after the wreck. Jarrett and track workers were able to retrieve Roberts from the fiery wreck, but the damage was already done, and Roberts would pass at the hospital. He was still alive after the initial contact, but ultimately succumbed to the flames and inhalation of smoke, meaning the Hans device would not have saved Fireball Roberts. Another 4 months would pass before the 10th Grand National Series fatality. 33-year-old Jimmy Pardue was running a tire test at the same track, Charlotte, on September 22, 1964. Pardue reportedly crashed through the turn 4 guardrail and went over the fence. From there, the car rolled down a 75-foot embankment and came to rest upside down. According to the Eugene Register Guard, Pardue was semi-conscious following the incident but would die at the same hospital as Roberts before him. Given the similarity of this to the wrecks at Langhorne and the stiffness of the Grand National cars, I cannot confidently say that the Hans device would have saved Jimmy Pardue. The 11th Grand National Series fatal crash would occur on January 5th, 1965, and would be the second fatality at Daytona International Speedway. Billy Wade was an up-and-coming 34-year-old from Texas who had just come off a 4-win season in 1964. It appeared he had a bright future ahead of him, which was snuffed during a tire test at the high banks. It is said that the Speedway audience heard an audible pop, which would have been the right front tire on Wade's Mercury heading into Turn 1. Wade had just recorded a lap average of 170.5 miles per hour before the incident, which saw the car slam into the wall twice at high speed. The car never rolled, nor did it set on fire, but the impact was hard enough to jolt the driver's seat to the right and bend the dashboard inwards. It's unclear whether or not Wade had been impacted by any of the car's bodywork. It's reported Wade died of serious head injuries, likely a basilar skull fracture, and other internal injuries. This was one of the hardest stock car crashes up to that point in history. But unless Wade had been impaled or crushed by parts of the car, I believe the Hans device may have been able to save Billy Wade. The 12th Grand National Series fatality was the second in the Southern 500. On September 6, 1965, 28-year-old Buren Skeen hadn't even completed the third lap of a race before he spun in Turn 2. Florida's Reb Wickersham sailed through the corner at full speed and directly into the driver's side door on Skeen's car, leaving one of the most sickening vehicle carcasses imaginable. Despite all this, Skeen actually lived for another week before dying in the hospital on September 13th. Given the severity of the impact and the collapse of the driver's cockpit, I cannot confidently say that the Hans device would have saved Buren Skeen. The 13th Grand National Series fatality came only a month later on October 17th. Harold Kite was a former Army captain who had won on the beach at Daytona back in 1950. He had just returned to the Grand National Series from a 9-year break only to be taken out on the first lap of the race in a 5-car incident in the National 400 at Charlotte. Kite was not the focus of any camera during the incident as 3 cars were riding the wall through the corner. He was hit once again in the driver's side door and was pinned inside the car. I can't find any images of the wrecked car, but if I had to guess, it most likely looked a lot like Skeen's, meaning the Hans device would not have saved Harold Kite. The 14th Grand National Series fatality would come before the second race of the 1967 season. On January 20th, Canadian Billy Foster was running practice at Riverside before losing his brakes going into the Turn 9 hairpin. He would hit the wall at an estimated 130 miles an hour and was reportedly killed instantly when his head directly struck the wall due to centrifugal force. This is not the same part of the track that Weatherly died, but it is a very similar circumstance. Once again, the Hans device was designed specifically to protect drivers in this exact kind of wreck, but given the condition of the car after the wreck, and this coming only a few years after Weatherly's wreck, I cannot confidently say the Hans device would have saved Billy Foster. Foster remains the only non-American to die in a NASCAR-sanctioned series event on American soil. The 15th Grand National Series fatality came on February 19, 1970, during one of the Daytona Twin 125s. 32-year-old Tomaj Prince was attempting to make his first NASCAR Grand National Series start, and ended up driving through the oil of a car blowing up in front of him. This caused him to spin perpendicular to the wall, with Bill Seifert running directly into Prince's driver's side door. Seifert was hospitalized with a concussion, but he would survive. Prince was declared dead at the scene. This is another wreck very similar to Kite and Skeen. There's not a lot in the way of details for Prince's condition immediately following the wreck, and the footage of the incident is not desperately great. Given the condition of the car and the circumstances for the wreck, I am actually willing to posit that the Hans device could have saved Talmadge Prince. The 16th Grand National Series fatality would come in the same event 2 years later. On February 17, 1972, 37-year-old journeyman driver Friday Hassler was attempting to make his 7th Daytona 500 when a melee occurred on the backstretch. Hassler lost control, attempting to avoid hitting the outside wall lightly. His car then rolled backwards into traffic and was blindsided on the passenger side at over 170 miles an hour by the 54 of Jimmy Crawford. This became one of the most famous NASCAR fatalities due to the haunting images of Hassler's bloodied driver's side door. Due to the sheer magnitude of Crawford's impact on the Hassler Chevrolet, there is no chance, even with the Hans device, that Friday Hassler would survive this crash in this car. The 17th Grand National Series fatality would come the next year and would be the first at Talladega. 31-year-old Larry Smith of Lunar, North Carolina was running by himself when his Mercury suddenly careened into the wall, slamming flush on the passenger side. It was a single-car incident. It was reported that Smith's headrest was broken by the impact. Had it not been for this detail, I would have been able to say that the Hans device would have saved Larry Smith, as the coroner's diagnosis said his ailments were primarily head injuries. But due to the broken headrest, I cannot confidently say the Hans device would have saved Larry Smith. The 18th Winston Cup Series fatality would also be the second fatality at Talladega. 1963 Daytona 500 winner Tiny Lund was drafting J.D. McDuffie down the superstretch when he tried to clear himself behind McDuffie. He misjudged the distance and sent himself and McDuffie spinning, creating a blinding smokescreen down the backstretch. Lund rolled back onto the straightaway and was hit on the driver's side door by 23-year-old Terry Fink. The driver's compartment of Lund's Dodge caved in, crushing him, ultimately leading to his death. Once again, the absurd speeds of Daytona and Talladega primarily contributed to the failure of the roll cages in these incidents. The Hans device would not have saved Tiny Lund. The 19th Winston Cup Series fatality wouldn't come for another 4 years. 29-year-old Ricky Knotts was attempting to make his first Cup Series start after failing to qualify the year before at Charlotte. On February 14, 1980, Knotts was running ahead of Blackie Wangerin in their twin 125 when the hood of Knotts' Oldsmobile suddenly flew up. In his confusion, Knotts hit the outside wall, which caused him to spin back towards the infield, where he slammed flush on a concrete wall on the passenger side. He was declared dead on arrival at the hospital. This is the exact kind of wreck the Hans device was designed for, and given how the car and the roll cage itself holds up in the wreck, I can confidently say that the Hans device would have saved Ricky Knotts. The 20th Winston Cup Series fatality would come 4 years after the relevant wreck. 48-year-old Bruce Jacoby had been a lifelong racer primarily in Champ Car before retiring in 1973 and shifting into a hobbyist NASCAR Cup Series career. He was attempting to make his second Daytona 500 in 1983 when he got loose out of Turn 2 during the first Twin 125. Heavy rain in the days leading to the race meant the grass in the backstretch infield was in the worst possible condition. Jacoby's Pontiac dug into the wet dirt and began flipping violently all the way down the superstretch. This wreck is strikingly similar to the well-known Rusty Wallace incident that happened 10 years down the line. Coincidentally, Rusty himself also flipped down this backstretch in 1983, but his car didn't take nearly the same level of harsh, energy-absorbing aerial impacts as Jacoby. All this being said, Jacoby survived the initial wreck and was flown to an Indiana hospital where he was eventually able to breathe without a respirator. His condition never improved though, as he spent the rest of his life in a semi-comatose state. He would die on February 4th, 1987. He suffered a severe brain injury during his 1983 flip, which would have without a doubt been tapered by a Hans device. I can confidently say the Hans device would have saved Bruce Jacoby. The 21st Winston Cup Series fatality occurred on November 11th, 1984. 32-year-old Terry Schoonover was making only his second career Cup Series start when his number 42 got loose out of turn 2. Schoonover made an overcorrection which sent him headfirst into the outside wall. From there, the car continued to roll down the backstretch and further down towards the inside of the track, where it would eventually hit a dirt embankment at an awful angle. And the left side of the car absorbed all the remaining energy, bringing the car to a stop. This was the first fatal crash in the 24-year history of Atlanta Motor Speedway. The details on this incident are very limited, but most reports I could find say that Schoonover died mostly from head injuries. It's also unclear if the first impact ended his life or if he was still in control of the car when it hit the inside embankment. Either way, this is once again the exact type of wreck the Hans device was designed for. All that being said, the second impact on the embankment is nothing to scoff at. I believe the Hans device would have saved Terry Schoonover, but he would have regardless been severely injured from this wreck. The 22nd Winston Cup Series fatal crash came at Michigan International Speedway on June 14, 1986. Corpus Christi's Rick Baldwin was just coming off his 31st birthday when he sailed into Turn 1. From the video footage, it looks like he lost a tire in some capacity, and his Buddy Arrington-owned Ford spun 180 degrees and slammed flush on the driver's side into the wall. Baldwin was cut out of the car and taken to the hospital in critical condition. He would spend almost 11 years in a coma before being declared dead on June 12, 1997. It was discovered that the window net on the car had failed, and Baldwin's family would sue NASCAR over this. But a Texas court would strike this down. It was argued by NASCAR that Baldwin's head hit the roll cage, not the wall. But either way, had there been a Hans device in place, his head wouldn't have hit anything. The Hans device would have saved Rick Baldwin. The 23rd Winston Cup Series fatal crash takes us back to Atlanta Motor Speedway. ARCA racing legend Grant Adcox was making his 60th Cup Series start when he cut a tire and slammed the outside wall flush on the passenger side before erupting into flames and rolling back down the banking towards the infield. Like Baldwin, he had to be cut out of the car, but would be pronounced dead on arrival at Atlanta's Baptist Hospital due to the head and chest injuries. This is yet another wreck where I can easily say the Hans device would have saved Grant Adcox. The 24th Winston Cup Series fatal crash would come on August 11, 1991. It was the fourth lap of the Watkins Glen event, and lifelong NASCAR owner-driver J.D. McDuffie was barreling down the long backstretch towards the right-hander of the carousel. It's still unknown to this day what failed on his number 70 Pontiac, but he would shoot straight through the turn, bringing Jimmy Means with him. The grass did nothing to slow down McDuffie, and he flew into the guardrail and fence on the passenger side at well over 170 miles an hour. The severity of the impact was so strong that the car flipped 180 degrees on its head before landing on the roof. He would die instantly from head and brain injuries. This wreck would result in Watkins Glen implementing the bus stop before the carousel, and it's also widely credited with the acceleration and influx of funding for the Hans device itself. This incident is incredibly violent, but it's also exactly what the Hans device was designed to protect against. The Hans device would have saved J.D. McDuffie. The 25th Winston Cup Series fatal crash occurred on February 11, 1994. 18-time NASCAR Cup Series winner and 20-year veteran of the sport, Neil Bonnet had scaled back to a part-time role in the summer of his career after multiple hard crashes at superspeedways. In an early practice, Bonnet lost the car in turn 2. An overcorrection led to the car spinning the opposite direction straight into the outside wall. He hit an awful angle on the driver's side, and severe head injuries would end his life at age 47. This ties directly into the 26th Winston Cup Series fatal crash, which would come 4 days later in another Daytona 500 practice session. A popular Goodies Dash Series driver named Rodney Orr sold his Dash car for a Cup Series car and was looking to begin his rookie season in 1994. This would come to an end when a shock absorber failed, and Orr was sent roof first into the outside wall. Once again, Orr's injuries were primarily in the head and chest. These incidents sent the NASCAR garage into a flurry to find a solution to the many injuries and deaths happening at high-speed tracks. The deaths of Bonnet and Orr are attributed in present day to the regulation of spring and shock settings, as well as, you guessed it, the development of the Hans device, which definitely would have saved both Neil Bonnet and Rodney Orr. The 27th Winston Cup Series fatality would occur on July 7, 2000. Only 2 months prior, fourth-generation racer and rising star Adam Petty would lose his life in a Busch Series practice at New Hampshire International Speedway after losing his brakes going into Turn 3. When the tour returned to that track in July, emotions were already running hot before 30-year-old Kenny Irwin Jr. would lose his brakes in the exact same spot, hitting the wall flush with the passenger side. There is no footage of either of these incidents, but the results were the same. Irwin's wreck led to NASCAR using restrictor plates for the main event. These two New Hampshire incidents in the summer of 2000 will also be a harbinger of one of the darkest periods in modern stock car racing history. Once again, both of these incidents were exactly what the Hans device was designed for, and it would have saved Kenny Irwin Jr. The 28th and final to this date fatal Winston Cup Series crash would occur on February 18, 2001. It is one of the most widely researched, widely documented, and widely remembered fatal crash in NASCAR history. On the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt was blocking for his two remaining team cars. Coming through turn 4, he clipped Sterling Marlin, sending his famous good wrench number 3 down the track. The momentum sent Earnhardt back up the track, where he would collect Ken Schrader and hit the outside wall at a nearly perfectly perpendicular angle at speeds of over 180 miles an hour. It's reported that Earnhardt's seatbelt failed from the impact, and the primary injury that did him in was a basilar skull fracture. Dale was a known advocate against the Hans device, as he believed it may pin or crush a driver against their seat in a hard crash, like he'd seen firsthand many times. But from 20 years of research, 20 years of what-ifs, we know that the Hans device would have saved Dale Earnhardt. Alright, you still with me out there? Let's do a quick review. In this video, we discuss 28 fatal NASCAR crashes over its 75 years of existence. In those 28 instances, I came to the conclusion that 13 of those drivers may have been able to survive had they been wearing a Hans device. This means that 14 of them would likely have also not survived. And once again, some of these are up to interpretation, such as Joe Weatherly and Bill Foster, who were involved in wrecks that the Hans device would have played an important role in, but due to the construction of NASCAR Cup Series cars pre-Gen 4, would have likely still perished due to the fundamental design flaws of the cars. This is where I open it up to the comments section. If you disagree with me in any of these interpretations that I've come to, please give you your best arguments in the comments section. I'd love to hear everyone else's opinions. The majority of Golden Age NASCAR fatalities would have been prevented by modern roll cages and stronger seatbelts, but we all know that hindsight is 20/20. So in conclusion, the Hans device remains the foremost safety feature to come out of the brutal and visceral rolling death traps that thundered around small town ovals in the 50s and 60s. This video is primarily to honor the sacrifice of these Wild West daredevils that gave everything they could in their day and ultimately contributed to the technology and regulations that keep our modern day heroes around to race another day. Thanks for watching, and I hope you took any level of enjoyment that you could out of this video. We'll see you in whatever comes next. Bye.